Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Procurement, How States Create Leverage and Interoperability. We're glad you have joined us and are excited to have phenomenal speakers with us today. I am Karen Daughtery. I am a K-12 program manager with IMS Global and will be your host for today's webinar. With me are Dan Rollier and Bruce Umstead. Dan and Bruce are going to share how state departments of education can work together with their local and regional educational agencies to ensure interoperability through state and local contracts. Please be reminded that your audio is muted and will remain muted throughout today's webinar. However, we want to make this as interactive as possible, so please utilize the Q&A feature or the chat window in your WebEx so that Bruce, myself, or Dan can answer any questions you have throughout our time together. As you logged into WebEx this afternoon, hopefully you saw a poll that was on your screen. We have 3 questions there for all of our attendees. Questions about your state's commitment and level of procurement and the power you guys have within your state. So during these first few minutes of our time together, we are going to ask for you to please take a look at those questions. The first one being, what is your state's understanding and commitment to interoperability? And the second one, what is your state's level of procurement power? There is a third question just so that we can better understand how those questions overlap. And again, we're going to talk about those throughout our time together, but wanted to give you a few minutes to take a peek at those before that comes up. So with no further ado, I would love to turn it over to our speakers. Again, we've got Dan. Dan is the Director in the Office of Research and Data Analysis in South Carolina Department of Education, and Bruce Umstead, who is the Director of State Programs with IMS Global. And we are going to get things straight off with Dan. Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So we're as a State Department, we've made a conscious decision that we are moving from an entity whose primary purpose is oversight to a support entity. So we've decided, and has become part of our mission and vision, that we want to support teachers in the classroom and support districts in their delivery of curriculum and improving education in South Carolina. And with that, so if those are our priorities, we have to decide what our system of beliefs are. What do we believe about data and technology use in South Carolina in order to make that change happen? So I wrote 4 of my personal belief statements: that teachers can use actionable, timely data to improve students' outcomes. Teachers will use the time saved through technology to improve student outcomes. Marketplace will supply goods and services if there's sufficient demand, and that no matter where I go to the ATM, if it gets me money, the money is going to end up coming out of my account. In other words, the very proprietary system of ATMs that existed when they first came out has morphed into almost a universal system that no matter where I go, as long as I'm willing to pay the extra exchange fee, I'm going to get the money that I need at the time, and I'll end up paying the bill in the end. Next slide. So what are the levels of procurement? What can we do as a State Department? Well, part is using the bully pulpit, right? The ability to speak around, well, to be knowledgeable about first, because you have to be aware of it in order to be able to speak to it, around interoperability standards and the benefits that come from adopting them, how to, what that means in terms of classroom time for a teacher, or the cost of managing ETLs for a tech department, or just how having a universal language and alignment between our systems moves us forward. So there's language out there that we can start to use in procurement. You can look at the statement of intent as outlined in IMS Global, or you can use some of the model RFP that are available through other standards organizations, and we're included links to those on the slideshow here so that you can have those as a resource. So more model language that allows you to identify specific standards is available on the IMS Global site, and they can go through and choose RFP language around the particular standard or subset of the data that you want to make sure is compliant in the RFP. So you can also look at what certification expectations are. So what does it mean to be certified? Does that mean that every field is available, or is there a core set that's available? And what is it that's being tested when somebody is identified as providing a certified product? So now how do I make sure that if a vendor isn't already certified, that is going to be able to reach the goals that I have to provide that level of support by the time that we're implementing the product that we're purchasing. And more than that, what happens as standards evolve? How do we make sure that people stay current with the standards in order to maintain an interoperable system through the time duration of the contract? So we've got a couple levers, and one of a major one is using it in the RFP language, and the other one is a service level agreement. So a kind of a holdback or a reward system that says that you as a vendor will be paid as long as the level of service that we expect around this particular tool is available. Next slide. Okay, so right now I've got an RFI out, and one of the sections is, RFI is the request for information, but what I'm doing is foreshadowing what's going to be in the request for procurement. And I'm telling vendors, as I'm searching up for information, that SCDE is going to adopt criterion around evaluation for interoperability. And I understand that the adoption of an interoperability standard is evolutionary endeavor. That's something that vendors work towards it, and it's something that is an ongoing process. And making complete certification on implementation a compulsory requirement would greatly reduce the number of people that could respond at that point in time to the RFP. But I'm not willing to give up on the long-term benefits of achieving interoperability, so I'm going to be looking for vendor partners that will make the same commitment. So to mitigate that risk and encourage the number of respondents, I've developed an evaluation system, a framework, if you will, for saying, all right, what's your level of commitment to reaching certification, and how willing are you to back up that claim that you're making? Because sometimes people are overzealous in their promises, and then once the contract is awarded, they might not have the same level of commitment. So I want to have encourage and have some teeth to the language. Next slide.
Okay, I think this is where I take over. We're going to actually look at the poll results. So Karen, who's filling in for Kara, is running the poll. If she could shut that down, we could take a look really quick at what the results are.
Absolutely. Just wanted to give everybody one more opportunity, Bruce and Dan. And remind them that that poll should be open on the side of your screen. You may have to click the three dots, open up the polling window. I see that we've got lots of folks connected. I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to answer those questions. I am about to close that poll, so as Bruce said, we can take a look at those of you who are on the line and where you guys stand in how you guys have procurement power within your state. So just a few more minutes, and I'm going to close that poll out.
Yeah, if you don't know, just answer D. The wrong answer is D. So we're just trying to figure out where everybody on the call is at. But hopefully you'll have time to answer this, and you know where your state's at in terms of procurement and interoperability. And we're just looking for how those two questions overlap.
All right, just a few more seconds to give everybody an opportunity who's still in progress. All right, I'm going to close this poll out, and you should see those poll results populating on your screen here in about 15 seconds. Thank you for everybody who participated. That gives us a snapshot of who's in the room. And while we're waiting on this to populate, please note that over in the chat window, Bruce was able to post those links that Dan mentioned in his slides, where you can find some of that information and direct links to those RFPs. Thank you, Bruce, for posting those in the chat window.
Okay, here we go.
All right, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Bruce. Everybody should see the poll results now in your polling window.
Great. Well, I guess on my direction, people answered D because we got a huge response on D for both questions 1 and 2, which of course then bleeds over into question 3. What we're trying to get at with this question is we're really trying to figure out what your state education agency's commitment and understanding of interoperability is. You know, obviously we have Dan on the phone from South Carolina, and he is using his bully pulpit, and we're setting up his presentation to show you what he's going to be doing in the state of South Carolina to drive interoperability in just a few minutes. And this part of our conversation is meant to draw you into the conversation. So can you, now that we have the results, Karen, can you reopen them so I can just look at some of the sample questions and speak to those? Are we able to open that back up so I can see
absolutely.
the sample?
Let's take a look. Let's go back to, how about we look at right here? Would that help?
Oh, it's on the slide that I was at. I was looking at some of the breakout questions that are only in the poll.
You mean the responses?
Yeah, the responses, sorry. The sample responses.
Okay, so I think if we hover over it, you can see the full response. There we go.
Okay.
There we go.
Great. All right. So basically, Dan would score, his state would score in the A column, right? They're actively engaged in developing and using interoperability standards. Dan belongs to IMS Global. He's a contributing member. He chairs our state education agency steering committee, which we have 8 states that are members, and they're participating in that steering committee, and he serves in that leadership capacity. And he's also, you know, very active. Obviously, he's doing the webinar, but very active in several of our specifications and providing state-level customer feedback on what those specifications should be. And so we're inviting states to get involved with IMS Global, but a lot of times they don't really understand what interoperability is. And so that's really where we find a number of states is kind of in that B range, where they may or may not use a set of standards for a certain purpose, but they don't really participate in any of the standards organization. Or they might be inquiring as to how to use those standards, but there's really not a level of commitment. I used to work for the Michigan Department of Education and kind of was part of the initiative back between 2007, 2013 of moving towards interoperability. And what usually leads a state to question the need for interoperability is when you start to purchase software or provide software that districts use on a daily basis, especially when it comes to either results reporting or in many cases providing student information systems or providing learning management tools and learning applications. Why don't we move to the next slide for the second question? And that's really what we're looking for. So how committed, how deep is the understanding at a state level for the need for interoperability versus the state level of procurement? And in Dan's case, we're going to talk about how he purchases software on behalf of the district. So all the districts use like a common student information system in South Carolina. That really is precipitating our work together on this that we're sharing in this PowerPoint, in this webinar. But when you start to look around at different states, what is the level of state procurement? And the higher the level of state procurement, the higher the need for interoperability and the higher the leverage points are for that. In the case like in Michigan, there's very little software that the Michigan Department of Education actually purchased on behalf of districts. But once we started receiving substantial grant money from the legislature around test readiness and data interoperability or data systems, for reporting those assessments, that's when interoperability became a much bigger requirement. So we started putting those into our grant RFPs too, is the level of commitment from the suppliers in the districts for requiring their suppliers to be interoperable. Next slide. And so when you're exploring this in your state, on behalf of either your district, your state, or if you're a supplier, you really need to look for that overlap, or what I call the Venn of Possibility. Where can the state make inroads to apply pressure and build towards leverage in terms of helping their state and their districts move to true interoperability? And that's really what today's webinar is about. Dan is about to explain, once he realized the leverage that he had, both in terms of his commitment and also his level of procurement power, he's going to show you what he's doing to actually leverage interoperability at scale for the whole state of South Carolina. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dan to explain the so what. Going into the slide, Dan, why don't you talk about how many students, again, how many districts, so people have a better understanding of what interoperability at scale means for South Carolina, as you then explain what you've been doing around your latest procurement initiative.
And before we go there, real quick, we do have some questions that have come in. This is just a quick reminder to those of you who are on the call. You are muted throughout, so we would love for you to pose some questions either in the Q&A or in the chat. And I wanted to bring attention to you, Dan, that one of the questions that has come in is, where can we find the RFI for South Carolina? So as you're going over your next few slides, I don't know if you'll be covering that or want to point that out as you're giving the example of South Carolina, but somebody has asked if the RFI for South Carolina can be shared somewhere.
Happy to share it, and it is being released through our MMO office. So right now, well, first of all, so I put things in context. We've existed since I got the job in 2015. I've been sole sourcing my student information system and my data collection system, and along with that, our IEP system is also at the tail end of the contract. So with all of those things being available for procurement at the same time, it was a great opportunity to rethink data collection in South Carolina. And if you looked at my current data structure, basically even we have the same SIS in every district. So I was querying table by table in from the school districts themselves and bringing that up into the state, and not really integrating the records or building a well-defined data system from it. So about 3 years ago, I learned about Common Education Data Standards and started changing the data structure at the state to the Common Education Data Standards. We've now completed that, so we are fully SEDS compliant around that data structure. So now I said, now how can I go through and leverage that data structure and reduce the demand on districts? So the goal of my RFI is to provide procure a SIS, an IEP, an assessment system, and provide every district in the state with their own ODS, and then draw from their ODS up to a statewide ODS, which would be a restricted number of elements. In other words, I don't need everything that's available in the district level. I just need a subset of it. But in order for us as a state to support every district having their own ODS, and if you looked at the shape of our state, our largest district is someplace in the 80,000 range, and our smallest district is less than 800 students. So we've got 82 public districts and wide variety in capacity in order to support an ODS. So that's why I'm taking it on as a state level task, and why interoperability is such a huge component of that, because otherwise I could not manage all the disparate systems that need to link together in order to inform instruction. So with that as the mindset of providing that as a service for each district in the state, I said, well, how do I then ensure compliance in an interoperable system? Because I've had an experience where people have made kind of commitments in an RFP, but because there were no teeth to it, it was easy to say, and then didn't see necessarily the results, and then we're put in a position of, well, then do you just fire the vendor and go back to RFP, which means losing all of the good because of some of the bad, or do you find a leverage point that helps everybody understand just the priority that I'm placing on a particular item? And that's where we ended up with this. So if I'm, this example is around one roster, but and one roster would apply probably to the SIS or to the ODS, right? Depending on where we were going to do the connection from. And saying if the vendor is agreeing that they're going to have, or not agreeing to provide compliance with one roster requirements within 12 months of the contract date, then they get 0 points in the evaluation. If they say, all right, look, I'll have it within 12, but after 6, they'll get 1 point. Available within 6 months of contract award date, then they get 2 points. 3 months, and 3 points, and available at the time contract is awarded, fully compliant, then they get 4 points. So this kind of I'll work with you scale in terms of the evaluation and when we're going to reach compliance, with no question that compliance certification is the goal, right? Then with that, so that's the promises part. And then the next slide illustrates the accountability portion that's attributed to it. So I called them SLA levels, or service level agreements levels. So if you're not willing to hold back any of the payment pending delivery of that service, then the promise isn't worth a whole lot. So the modifier is 0, right? If you agree to a 10% holdback on the total value of the contract, then and agree that for every day after you're late in delivering on that promise, right, then the SLA modifier is 1/4. If you agree to 25% holdback of the annual value of the contract and 1% penalty per day, then your SLA modifier is 1/2. And if you agree to a 50% holdback with a 1% of the total annual contract per day penalty, then you get the full value of your promise, right? So if you said you're going to have it within 6 months, and then you're willing to put your money where your mouth is, then we come to this agreement. So setting the levels is a little bit challenging, and certainly varies with the value of each contract. So for our CIS, that's about 3.9 million annual, right? So 1%, 25% or holdback is a fairly significant commitment, right? Just shy of $1 million being held back against future delivery. And then the 1% per day is about $39,000 a day for failure to deliver. So it's a fairly serious commitment, but it also carries a significant reward with it. And basically, to figure out the evaluation, you multiply the commitment level times the modifier, and you end up with the points that are awarded for that portion of the contract. Next slide.
Yeah, so Dan, that's really fascinating that you've got both the implementation and ongoing support incentivized to stay current, and then you've got that we'll work with you commitment to get up to speed by the time everything's in place. So before we move to this slide, let's just talk quickly about, I know that you and I talked and we shared other documents, and we're about to talk about how IMS provides documents and stuff, but maybe we could share a little bit of the insight that you and I had trying to get to a point where, you go through an RFI process, then an RFP process, then you do the award and everything, and everything looked great in the RFP responses, right? And you typically weight cost a little higher than everything else. Let's talk a little bit about how your thought process in going into this about how ongoing maintenance of effort for interoperability you see playing out, as you go into it. I think, talking about, how long the initial contract's for and what the no bid extension opportunity is. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, because one of the reasons for shorter procurement timeframes is that you don't always have incentivize a vendor to keep and maintain the product, and you end up with what you bought 5 years ago is still what you've got 5 years later when the rest of the world has moved forward. So how then do you enter into a long-term commitment if you're not able to shop what the rest of the world has? So I'm trying to how do I turn this into a long-term partnership? So because of the massive implementation costs that come with purchasing an SIS and even to a lesser degree the IEP and assessment system in terms of scope and people that you need to, the data conversion and the training that goes on, I'm applying for a special procurement ruling that would allow me 2 years for implementation, then a 5-year contract with 2 3-year extensions, so that because I'm looking for a long-term contract, we're looking at going out. This would be a 13-year, potentially a 13-year award, and that's part of what I want to incentivize.
Right, and so that's why it's important to not only build it into the RFP in the RFI language like you're doing, but you've actually figured out a way to have leverage through the contract to get people to dedicate money and funding to interoperability. It's just part of the work that you're going to be doing. Congratulations on that.
You know what? This is our second bite at the apple in terms of restructuring or structuring a data system, and the world has moved forward, and we're blessed with the opportunity to revisit it, and I'm very, very fortunate. So I'm actually. What I found is that in my discussion, I'm responding to a question, okay? It says, are there suggestions available for those states that have state contracts that were contracted prior to the state's work with interoperability standards? And what I've found with my vendors is that I've been very, very transparent about my level of commitment to interoperability. And I've put it out there, and my current vendors that are interested in continuing the relationship with me are already working very hard to meet the interoperability requirements that I'm outlining. So it's really about communication and expectations. You know, I bear a very real cost for every ETL that I write to convert data that doesn't come up in a standardized form. Every teacher bears a very real cost in their lack of accessibility to data or the time that's lost because of not building systems around those. And it goes back to belief number 3, right? That the marketplace will respond to customer demand, and they'll either respond by leaving the marketplace because they fail to read the future well, or they'll flourish because they join and ride the wave.
So Carly, I'm reading your question too, and it's specifically like everything's in place, and from a contract, how do we create leverage, which can be a little bit tricky. I'm the State Education Programs Director for IMS, but I'm also running Case Network, which is a single source of authoritative versions of state academic standards and workforce competencies in a single location, both verified and then marked official by states as they join the effort. And so I'm looking at RFP leverage. I got a call last week from one of our very active suppliers, finding out that a very large school district in the Midwest required to move to Case and Case Network specifically as a standard. It felt really good that we had some solutions there, and so that's new procurement. I'm looking around the country, and there's an existing ecosystem that requires interoperability at a certain level. So I'm going to see if they won't upgrade their use case that they give to their platform providers, that they'll kind of push down to the rest of the suppliers on the case side. That's an opportunity if you can make a commitment and then start to look for levers across your ecosystem to get some things to move, whether it's one roster, whether it's LTI, Caliper. We've even started to see some RFPs with some Caliper language in it. But my recommendation is to look for those new initiatives that are going to be leveraging those existing platforms or those existing systems in place, and see if you can't work in the interoperability opportunities or requirements there. We're definitely looking at that for Case and Case Network. It definitely helps when there is a new RFP on the street. I met with a very large district this morning, and we were talking about how they could leverage LTI for single sign-on, one roster obviously for rostering, but then also grade pass back for LTI and one roster. And they already are in contract but they're just kicking off the project, so they're going to go and look for ways the supplier can save money by going to a standards-based approach for handling those types of activities. I think what Dan, don't skip over what Dan was saying, is that in the contract he's trying to establish a partnership, because he doesn't want to manage a 13-year contract where everything's an extra cost, everything's an add-on. And that's what we have seen in the interoperability space. We design our standards so that it actually saves everybody money and makes it easier to plug and play resources. And so sometimes it's hard to get suppliers to think like that. And that's why we're talking today about creating that leverage at the state level buy. But if it doesn't exist, then you got to look at those partnership opportunities and those cost-saving opportunities for your suppliers as well. Dan, would you agree with that? I mean, have you run into that since you've been running on some cost savings?
Cost savings. That's part of what I'm trying to quantify. Is where I'm seeing savings is not necessarily in direct dollars, but in time and effort, and making those tangible. I need to do more of my own homework, so I'm making that case available to other people.
Right. And one of the projects I got started in Michigan is an interoperability layer, and it was nice when there was grant funding and everybody was participating because the grant was requiring it. But they've been able to get to probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the students inside of their, it's called the Michigan Data Hub. They're a member of IMS Global, and they just became certified in one roster. And they were able to do it by just continuing adding additional connections to suppliers and adding value. They actually had to, what I say, hold their breath for 18 months. Now they're funded by the legislature again. But for those 18 months, they were kind of self-sustaining. And now they've been figuring it out on how to add, the next link in the chain, make it easier for people to share their data through this interoperability layer. Now they're going to add state reporting and so many other things, and that's all without RFP requirement. It's more using interoperability standards to lower costs for everybody across the state and across the digital ecosystem. At this point, we want to respect time. Karen's going to pick it up.
I do have a little perverse humor to share, right?
Okay.
Because we had actually had an RFP that go out around our teacher evaluation system, and well, no, that wasn't the funny part, but anyway, we had not decided on our interoperability standard at that point. So again, the procurement had been secured and all that thing. And then when we were meeting with the vendor and said, boy, I really wish I had included the particular data standard in the language, they said, oh, well, we've been doing that work with another state and we're happy to provide that. I was like, it's out there. Yeah. It's part of the conversation. Yeah. We just need to raise awareness.
And the reason why I laughed, Dan, is I helped a losing company bid on that a couple years ago when I was a consultant. So that's why I'm laughing. Yeah, that required a couple of all-nighters to get that submission in, and they would have provided you with some interoperability too. So I'm glad you were able to get that. But that's why I was laughing, because I remember that RFP fondly. So. All right, Karen, take it.
Well, guys, I appreciate this. Absolutely. I appreciate this conversation, and, just following up on what Dan just said, it's all about the conversation, getting that awareness out, and that is one of the great benefits that IMS provides for our members and our non-members. It's a place where our states and our institutional members can come together, collaborate, share the work that they've done, create the resources that they've needed, create a lot of the resources that Dan and Bruce spoke about on today's call, specifically around that RFI and RFP language and documents, examples that have been used, letters to specific publishers that have been created by other institutions and out there for you guys to use. I wanted to bring attention to one of the places where we have lots of resources for our K-12 and state agency members, and that is at imsglobal.org/K-12 Playbook. In our playbook, we've got all of those resources that I just mentioned to help our districts transition into a fully integrated digital ecosystem. Whether you're just starting out at that commitment level, maybe your state is just starting to have those conversations, just starting to get involved in this thing called interoperability, or you're ready to build that foundation, looking at that statewide student information system and rostering the applications that are there for your students and teachers to use. All of our resources in this playbook are organized into these areas and hopefully meet our members where they are. And as you can see by our diagram, most of these areas overlap. So you will find resources that fit your needs in multiple areas of the playbook. One specific resource that I think kind of plays off of the question that one of our callers had, Carly mentioned, and Bruce spoke to it already, but what do we do when that we're already in a contract, we've already put everything into place, it's time for a renewal, or we're starting to look at those grandfathered contracts? One thing we wanted to point out for all of you guys is something we have on our website that could be used as an addendum to some of your contracts. And this addendum that we have, as an example here on the screen, was used by one of our K-12 districts, and it specifically states that even though the vendor agreed to IMS certifications, they are currently up to date on the current specification. We know that this contract is going to be a multi-year contract. What happens when the specification changes? This addendum to that contract language states that this vendor is willing to stay up to date. It gives very specific timeline of the institution's expectation. This is a great example of the type of resources that IMS provides on our website. All of these can be modified to meet the needs of those of you who are using them. And folks like Bruce and Dan, as well as all of our members, are always there to help, collaborate, let you know the roadblocks that they've had, the successes they've had, and help each other as we move towards that next generation of digital ecosystems. Before I close out, we've got just 1 or 2 more minutes. I would like to ask Bruce and Dan, if there are folks on the call today who they themselves, or maybe their department, or maybe their organization in its small little part of the greater good is interested in this interoperability, what would you say to them? How can they get their states excited, involved? What are their starting points? How can they start to have this conversation with their states so that the state agency can become interested in interoperability? Who wants to close us out with that question?
Well, that's my job, so I'll step up and say, let's talk, right? I mean, my job is to figure out ways to get states engaged in this important work. We have a range of states already participating for a number of reasons. Anything from state assessment, we have very active members at the state level in our QTI initiative and our state assessment ILN. Obviously, I also work on Case Network, and that's getting the curriculum teams and the standards authors to understand the need to publish their standards in an interoperable format, but we've got a wide range of things. We're trying to engage state agencies through an organization known as IMAC. It's really the data center, the data governance group at the departments, but the state education CIOs participate in that. Dan's very active in that. We have 3 or 4 state CIOs that are active in both IMS and in IMAC. IMAC is actually putting together an interoperability roadmap and looking for use cases that I'll be the point person working with them on that for IMS. But I'm more than happy to reach out and make connections to your state's either CIO, curriculum team, assessment team, whatever part of the organization that would help you most in solving some of the problems. And that's what we have to be focused on, is how do we solve problems for districts through interoperability. And when we do that, states listen, they tend to put resources against it, and they tend to engage. So those are the opportunities we're looking for. So my contact information is correct and official on the screen. I'll be happy to help you with that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for the resources. Thank you for the information you shared. And as Bruce mentioned, their contact information is on the screen, as well as 2 other URLs and email addresses that you can utilize to contact us. Everybody that has registered for today's event will get a follow-up email with today's recorded session, as well as any resources that we have to share. We thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to you joining us in the future on another one of our IMS Global calls. Thank you. Bye-bye.